Hey guys, this is Lucas from Better Coding Academy, and in this video I want to share with you one of my favorite custom React hooks, and I call it the useGenerateId hook. I'm going to explain to you how it works, how you can kind of write your own and make changes to it as you see fit, but then also what we are going to be using it for and how it benefits us in writing better components. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is I've got a little bit of a form here, so I've just set up a basic parcel environment. I've got a parcel here as a dependency, obviously, to get this whole thing set up, and I have a whole video on parcel if you want to check that out as well. But then I've got an alias here for hash root, which I'll be using in just a bit. Just a very few dependencies, a very simple thing. A few styles here just to make it look slightly better. So I've got a root component here with a form, two labels and two text fields. Incredibly simple, no kind of form library or anything like that. I just really want to showcase this hook. So now for the labels, I've just put some very basic styles. So I've got display block, I've made it a bit bold and added a bit of margin just to make it look nice. But that's really all we need here. And basically right now, clicking these won't do anything. So with labels, one of the things that makes them very nice is when you have them attached to an input field or to a checkbox or something, clicking the label itself will actually focus the input. And in the case of checkboxes and radio buttons, it will actually select that checkbox or that radio button. So the way that we normally do that is we need to use an ID. So with the label, we have something called HTML4. The actual prop name inside of, or the actual attribute name in HTML is actually for, but because for is a reserved keyword inside of JavaScript, the React guys have basically renamed it to HTML4. So we can have something like this, and you would have HTML4 equals name, for example, and then over here you can do ID equals name. You can do something similar for email, so let's just say we do email like so, and we can put ID equals email here. So if you do this, technically it does solve the problem. So if we have a look here now, if we click, you see it will focus and it will work correctly. However, this is actually problematic for a couple of reasons. One of them is that we've hard-coded an ID here, and you might have another component with a different set of functionality, but it might also have the same ID. So you can kind of get around that problem, I guess, if you namespace it a little bit. So you might call this one root form underscore name or something like that. So you can really mess around with that and try to make it as unique as possible and kind of have a whole namespacing thing there. But there's still a problem with that, which is one of these things I've got in this tab over here. So this over reactor.io is actually Dan Abramov's blog. He's the creator of Redux and currently works on the Facebook React team as well. And this is one of the things that I read and I kind of really resonated with, is that one of his principles for writing resilient components is that no component should be a singleton. So sometimes we assume a certain component is only ever displayed once, such as a navigation bar. However, this assumption often causes design problems that only surface much later. So one of the things that he really talks about is having your app rendered twice and seeing if there are any problems, and seeing if the app still behaves as expected or if you'll run into errors. Now, in the case of our component here, the root component, if we have IDs hard-coded here, you can technically render this root component twice. And obviously, we can do that same thing here. So we can just do root and then root again. However, the thing with this is now you see that our IDs no longer work. And the reason for that is because we're sharing the same ID inside of that component. So no matter what we use here, and we can use something, totally random like that, and we can do that, for example, for both, then both of these would still have that same ID problem because you're rendering that same text field twice. And not only to mention that, but actually having the same ID twice inside of a page is technically invalid HTML as well. So, if you're kind of trying to get SEO points and whatnot, that might have a negative impact depending upon the search engine and the circumstances surrounding that. So all in all, it's really not a great user experience, and from a developer point of view, it also doesn't make sense for us to hard code IDs. So that's where the useGenerateId hook comes in, and I'll be writing that with you now. So generally what I like to do is, in this case here, I might have a new folder, or I might call this one helpers, and then I might have hooks inside of there. So I usually have something called helpers, and then say, for example, in this case, I'll put all the hooks inside of hooks. So just to demonstrate a little bit of the directory structure that I would use. And inside of here, we can do a new file, and let's call this one useGenerateId.js. So I like to go with, one functionality per file. So here we just do, useGenerateId, and this is kind of the very basic skeleton. Would look something like this. So we have useGenerateId, and currently obviously it's just empty. We're going to just put that in later. But now that we've got this here, we can import it. So we do import useGenerateId from, and I set up that alias earlier on, as I mentioned. So hash root, I like to do this for the SRC directory. So hash root /helpers, and then hooks. and then use generate ID. If you don't have aliases set up or you don't want to do this, what you can also do is, because we're currently inside a root, you can do // to components, // to src, and then helpers hooks. So basically, instead of writing this, you can just write // totally up to you. But I prefer this, and there are semantic reasons for that as well that I might get into in another video, but that's for another time. So let's just import this one here and leave it like so. And now let's write out this file here. So the basic idea is this file is going to, when run as a hook, it's going to give us back a function, and this function we're going to use to generate IDs inside of our component. So the way that we would use it is something like this. You would do const generate ID equals use generate ID like so. And instead of writing name here, instead of doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to put curly braces around that, and we're going to write, actually curly braces and then round brackets, and then we're going to write generate ID here like so. And we're going to do the same thing for email. So I'm going to grab that and then just do that again, and do generate ID here. So we do generate ID name, generate ID email, and what this would allow us to do is, theoretically, every single time we render this component, it would give us a new set of IDs, so that when we render root twice, we won't have any clashing issues. So over here, the way this code looks is we're actually going to use useMemo from React, and we're going to have a little counter. So I have a counter, and I'm just going to set it to 0. And notice how I'm putting this in the global namespace. I'm not putting it inside useGenerateId, and this is very intentional, and you'll see why later on. So now that we have this, what we're going to do is we're going to set the counter for this specific iteration of useGenerateId. So we can just do, like, say, for example, const count, or you can call this one ID as well. It's really up to you what you call this, unique ID or just ID. And then we can do useMemo here. And this is going to return us, useMemo takes in a function, and then the function resolves a certain value. So in this case, we're going to do ++ counter. So this adds 1 to counter and then returns that result. So the first time we run useGenerateId, this will return us 1, and it will permanently set counter to 1. So then next time when you run useGenerateId, it will actually set it to 2. But we're going to put square brackets here as the second argument, an empty array. And what this means is, without going into too much detail on how useMemo works, is what we're doing here is this ensures that we only run ++ counter once every single component. So not every single render, but every single component, every single time we mount a component. So for example, in the case of root here, if I mounted root twice, as you saw inside of index before, then we would have ++ counters, and then we'd have 2 copies of it. But if we were just to re-render root, so for example, if we had a state update here and this were to run again, this would not give us any new IDs. And that's actually really important, because that way we don't have this counter that just keeps going up and up and up unnecessarily. We can keep that very, very lean. And even though it's a trivial thing and hypothetically should work either way, just keeping in mind these small things is quite important in my mind to developing good applications. So anyways, we have an ID here, and what we're going to do is just return a function, and the function we're going to take in a suffix, or you can take in a call it a prefix, whatever you want. But I like to do something like this. So it's a very simple function that just returns a string, and we're just going to do ID and then put that unique ID there. And then you do an underscore, whatever you want, or just put the suffix directly on. It's totally up to you, but something like that. And yeah, feel free to customize this however you want. And we got useGenerateId here. And that's the code. So this should work. So now that we have this, let's go back to our page and let's click on these and make sure they still work, which they do. Right click, inspect, and we're going to have a look at this as well. So you notice here we have ID1 name here, ID1 email, and ID1 email. So what I'm going to do is just to demonstrate that the use memo is not actually increasing the counter every single time. We're actually going to add in just a little bit of state here. So we can just do, we'll do a little value for the name. So value equals name, and then we'll do an on change. So this one we can just have an EVT, a set name, EVT.target.value like so. We do something like that. And then we can just do a const name, set name equals use state. I'm going to rely on Prettier to reformat this for me, hopefully, and then do use state over here as well. So brilliant. Now that we have this here, it allows us to re-render the component, and we can actually see that the component is re-rendering just by writing rendering in there, of course. So now you see it's rendering once, which is fine. And as I type in here, it keeps rendering more times. But what you'll notice is that we still keep that same ID. So this is really important. If we didn't do that, and for example, if we just did a const ID equals ++ counter or something like that, you'll notice what happens is that it still works, but every time that we type in here, the IDs just keep incrementing. And like I said, it's just these small inefficiencies that you should be wary of and just keep in mind as you're developing. So this is one of the things I would do to address that. So anyways, now that we've got that over here and our ID is generated encapsulated properly, let's try adding in this root a second time again and see if that will work. So just copy paste that and add in the fragment at the beginning. So now we're rendering it twice, and what you'll notice is that it works beautifully. So we have that working perfectly, and when we inspect, you'll notice we get ID2 down here, and as we type in that, it doesn't actually change that to ID3 or anything, and we still have that working perfectly for each component. So this is one of the hooks that I really like to use, and one of the things I think is great about it is that it's relatively simple, but it actually goes into a lot of detail on just making sure that you take good care of your code and looking at semantics, looking at all these principles for really building great React applications. And that's why I really like to use this hook and why I wanted to demonstrate it today. So I hope you guys have learned something from this today. Feel free to like and subscribe if you want. But yeah, that's all I've got for you in this video. This has been Lucas from Better Coding Academy, and see you guys later.